All right, friends, I hope you all had a good lunch and a little break between the intense discussions of this morning and the ones that are going to follow. One of the distinct pleasures of this format is that even as we invite some we target some scholars and invite them to speak, then the call for papers gives us the opportunity to learn of interesting and fascinating and cutting edge scholarship that is going on and to bring this to this conversation as well. And so it is my pleasure to present to you three speakers for today. Um, the session is packed, obviously. We have three speakers and just an hour and 15 minutes. So what we decided to do is I'm going to very strictly keep the time for every speaker at under 20 minutes so that we have 15 minutes of discussion at the end. But what I'm going to do at the end of each speaker, I'm going to ask you to just collect your thought for 1 minute and write down your question so that we will be able to field questions for all of them at the end. Our first speaker is Chuan Li from the Free University of Berlin. And he is presenting to us a paper titled In Search of Priestly Witness, a Barthian Intervention in the Chinese Church-State Relationship in a Neoliberal Age. Welcome.
Thank you for the introduction, Hannah. Hello, everyone. Very glad to join this session. As you can see, I'm a young public theologian here, and I'm also a political scientist. So in my presentation, I try to integrate the theological and political insights I learned from Barth. Specifically, in my presentation, I try to suggest a theological proposal for reimagining the relationship between the church and the state in the context of the Chinese neoliberal regime. It consists of three parts. First, I argue that the rise of a neoliberal state has changed the Chinese political landscape over the past 4 decades and constrained the collective responses of the Chinese house churches in their cooperative and negotiating strategies. Second, I'd examine 2 recent theological announcements by the church leaders and evaluate their strengths and weaknesses in addressing the state-church relationships. And this critical analysis is followed by a rediscovery of Barth's political theology or theological politics of priestly witness, which has laid a Christological foundation for the integrity of faith community and shed light on their primary concerns and actions towards the Chinese neoliberal state. So why choose Barth? I think Barth's account is compelling for 2 reasons. First, his constant stress on the central role of Christ sets a dogmatic parameter for integrating critical and constructive components of priestly witness of the church, making his account accessible to Chinese Christianity with its steadfast Christological commitment and constant request for the integrity of faith community. Second, Barth's multi-dimensional vision of priestly witness makes space for the contextual elements identified by recent scholars, which enable us to integrate Chinese realities into the church's theological agenda. So let me introduce a brief background here. Global recent history has witnessed that dominant groups have radically expanded their economic and political power in coordination with the rise and consolidation of neoliberal states over the past half-century. In his book, A Brief History of Neoliberalism, David Harvey provides an astute survey of neoliberalism since the 1970s, tracing diverse neoliberal trajectories in different regions, including transitional China. This historical and comparative investigation allows Harvey to define neoliberalism as a political project that aims to revitalize capital accumulation and restore the class power of the capitalist elites. The project includes 2 intertwined aspects: operational strategy and theoretical design. The first aspect refers to a set of deliberate strategies to create conditions for the dual goals by means of corporatization, commodification, and privatization of public assets. The second aspect is a set of political and economic proposals that human well-being can be best advanced by maximizing entrepreneurial freedoms within an institutional framework of private property rights, self-regulated markets, and free trade. Contrary to the neoliberal discourse that downplays state intervention, the state, once transformed into a set of neoliberal institutions, must be actively involved in entrepreneurial and authoritarian practices to maintain the neoliberal order. Harvey labels this new type as neoliberal state. In my previous work, I have complemented Harvey's analysis by stressing that the party state has shaped the unique trajectory of transitional China, but it facilitates and sustains a fundamental change towards state capitalism. The general motif of the reform period was neoliberal, geared both towards diminishing the role of the state in welfare provision and increasing individual responsibility for social security and well-being. While the reform agenda seemed tactical in its initial stages, it soon became more radical, and it found its mature form in the early 21st century. The authoritarian nature of the Chinese neoliberal state is manifested in its dealings with civil society in general and house churches in particular. To maintain the neoliberal order, the party state rose not simply through repressive measures, we heard of this, but also by gaining popular support through favorable responses to people's material interests that do not directly challenge the party and the state. This repression plus responsiveness strategy is illuminated in the official registration of religious groups. It has distinguished church groups that work to improve public services and enhance political stability from those that consist of political and legal activists and oppose the regime. Through effective containment of the first group and repression of the second group, the party state closed off avenues of protest and circumvents critique of political and social problems. Unsurprisingly, the outcome is favorable to authoritarian resilience. The past several decades of interactions between the state and the church have witnessed, whenever possible, the house church tending to obey the party state in their cooperative and negotiating efforts with local officials. The driving force underlying such strategies was the fundamental concern for survival. Two exceptional cases were the collective announcement by the house church pastors and theologians in 1998 and 2018, respectively, which expressed immediate concern about repression. In defense of their Christian faith, they raised theological responses to the authoritarian rule of the state. As scholars have observed, it was their fundamentalist or pietistic beliefs that shaped their understanding of the church-state relationship and empowered them in pursuit of collective resistance. In other words, their moral resources comes from upholding Christ as a supreme Lord of the church, a remarkable legacy of modern Chinese theology since the early 20th century. However, their theological statements can be critiqued as both arbitrary because they justify the separation of the church and state simply by appealing to Christology, and incomplete because they are silent on their cooperation in practice. Their moral convictions will be undermined by the temptations of opportunism and, more importantly, by their indifference to religious rights and human well-being outside the church. Moreover, most of the church leaders who participated in resistance seem to have misplaced their expectations of the state, exposing their incapacity to comprehend the role and function of the party state in a neoliberal regime. What they need, therefore, is to develop a dogmatically faithful and politically engaging account that enables the church to fulfill its public service and witness. Karlbach's fundamental insights here, the priestly witness of the Christian community, are a vital reference for the Chinese house churches. So let's move to the part of carbon. Barth's deep involvement in political and ideological struggles, risking his career and even his life, is well documented by scholars. It is not surprising that many associate Barth with the idea of resistance, drawing parallels between imagining resistance to the existing state and the status quo church. What I venture here is more nuanced reading of Barth's political theology, which surpasses his theological witness of resistance. Let me start with a recent observation by Christian Keith, who highlights that as a dogmatic theologian, Barth sought to respond to the issues of culture and politics, the predicament of the people, and the prospect of human dignity in times of crisis. For our purpose, such a theological commitment and consistency enable Barth to navigate political currents and articulate his vision of priestly witness in its normative, structural, and practical aspects, as I shall elaborate in a little more detail. Barth's normative account of priestly witness took shape in the early 1930s. In the face of aggressive Nazism, it was crucial to make a strong case for the church mission in its critique of the state, as well as a notion of the responsible church under such a totalitarian regime. For these reasons, Barth devotes his essay Church and State to the extension of his theological thesis beyond the Barmen Declaration. Here we find Barth's controlling concept, intercession, aiming to describe the normative link between the church and the state. The church's authority derives from his priestly duty, reminding the state of his duty to use power justly as guardian of the law and of the common good. To be witness to the church implies being responsible to it and fulfilling the church's civil duty, which is called responsible choices of authority, responsible decisions about the validity of laws, responsible care for their maintenance, and in a word, political action, which may also mean political struggle. And of course, against the quietistic tendencies of Lutheran tradition and aligning more closely to the Reformed tradition, Barth reminds us that no matter how the state abuses its power, and even when it turns from protection to suppression, the church can never be its enemy by refusing to resist. Instead, he stressed that through the church's criticism, the state is honored because the church itself is God's instrument to save the state from its misuse of power. In resisting the unjust state, the church is in fact being responsible to the state. As for the state, since it also falls under the authority of God, it has a legitimate role as guardian, preaching and sustaining earthly peace and justice, and serving the church by granting it its freedom to be the church. During the post-World War II reconstruction, Barth published another important work, the essay The Christian Community and the Civil Community. In this work, his theological politics of priestly witness found structural and practical maturity. Like the private church and state, here the central theme continued to be the normative roles and the relationship of the two communities. Theologically, these two dynamic communities should be distinct and independent, while also connected and differentiated. Moreover, the distance to the world defines the interrelationship between the church and the state. That is, the more proximity to the world, the more responsibility held to the other. Barth asserts that, quote, the real church must be the model prototype of the real state, end of quote. This implies that the church should remind the state of its true purpose, that is, to bring honor to God. Jesse Covenhoven reminds us that Barth's positive assessment of the state as a divinely ordained gift with its telos in the kingdom of Jesus Christ constitutes a fundamental insight of Barth's political theology. In this light, while the state is more distant from God than the church, it is a difference primarily in quantity rather than quality. In other words, the distinction between the church and state is functional rather than ontological. According to Barth, this closely relates to the priestly task of the church as the inner circle, which necessitates that the church is not politically indifferent and or neutral. But the genuine innovative aspects of Barth's thesis is the concrete examples of analogical practice which connect the church and the state and are particularly relevant to the Chinese context. For example, since the church is a witness of divine justification, it will always urge the state to establish just law to limit and preserve humanity of all. Thus, the church must stand for the constitutional state and against its degeneration into tyranny. Moreover, since the church is a fellowship of free people called by the word of God, it must affirm basic political, social, and religious rights of every citizen. Thus, it will always reject any form of practical dictatorship, which is most evident in totalitarian or authoritarian regimes. Here's my conclusion. To reshape the theological vision and voice of the house churches, it is crucial to ask what new order should be in the making, in accordance with their commitment to Christ and their responsibility to the state. Three of Barth's insights can be identified at this fundamental level. First and foremost, the priestly responsibility of the church must be informed by Jesus Christ and be responsive to the world of politics in witness. Frequently, the Chinese house church leaders direct their attention to the legal status of the church, as well as the rights of religious freedom granted by the state, and therefore divert their focus towards the Almighty God revealed in the resurrection and the proclamation of Jesus Christ when he declares, all authority in heaven and on earth has been given to me. Decades of political lessons reminds us it's always imperative that the church first submit itself to the divine word in order to acquire new strength in its political witness and develop a fundamental relationship with the state. Second, it is also crucial to extend the church's initiative beyond the immediate concerns regarding religious rights and repressions, and instead embrace the role of safeguarding humanity in its concrete and common form. It is essential for the house churches, as they articulate their political aspirations and ecumenical vision, if they are to participate in critical solidarity with Chinese neoliberalism. Finally, Barth's approach to political vision distanced itself from both compromise and indifference. His ultimate concern is that responsible and responsive action can never arise out of the present world we share with our neighbors and enemies. Applying this lesson into the context of the Chinese house churches, it becomes imperative for them, drawing upon the tradition of Chinese theology, to engage in an informed and robust exploration on ongoing debates concerning state governance, and then create a unique intellectual and moral position for themselves. Only through such deliberate and intentional steps can the transformative power of priestly insistence can be realized, enabling the churches to effectively respond to the state in either critical or constructive ways. Thank you.
And then our next speaker is Raymond Carr, currently at Harvard Divinity School. And he's going to talk to us about strange fruit. Karl Barth, Black Religion, and the Ellipsis of the Imagination of Matter. Welcome.
So I'm going to begin like I typically begin in a class when I hear a song from Nina Simone.
That strange We are on the and we're at the room. Riding body, we remember. Right here from the pocket street. As you see all the guys down. In all sweat it now. Magnolia, peace, sweat. Then the sadness may right. It is a smooth crawl. That rain together above them. So balance. Wow. Sure.
I want to begin by reading my abstract because you all didn't get to see that. And that's when I thought this paper would be about 30 minutes. This paper, and I would do also 3 quick quotes right after that. This paper explores the nexus between Karl Barth and Black religion by appealing to the aesthetics of Strange Fruit, a poem written by Abel Meeropol under his pseudonym Lewis Allen. The poem is immortalized in song by Billie Holiday, Nina Simone, and others, and functions as an important framework for revisiting the encounter between Karl Barth and Charles H. Long, the historian of religions, who is described by Barth, without being given a name, as an enigmatic, quote, dusky theological colleague, a literally black colleague, close quote. Following Long, we will relocate the site of strangeness from Barth's discovery of the strange new world within the Bible to blackness or black religion as the locus for strangeness in the United States. In repositioning the black religious experience alongside Barth's view of revelation, we can reimagine matter and re-enchant the way we understand the aesthetics of creation. As a bonus, this project incorporates resources discussing Karl Barth from Charles Long's unpublished papers in the Codex Charles H. Long Papers Project at Harvard University. Strange Fruit, Karl Barth, Black Religion, and the Ellipsis of the Imagination of Matter. 3 quotes. Southern trees bear strange fruit, blood on the leaves, and blood at the root. Black bodies swinging in the southern breeze, strange fruit hanging from the poplar trees. Charles Long. How do you like, this is his word to Karl Barth, how do you like this strange place called the United States? And according to Barth, he said it with a subtle smile. Then finally, from Barth's Word of God, Word of Man, what is this fruit? This answer is suggested by the title of my address. Within the Bible, there's a strange new world, the world of God, close quote. What might we find when we shift the locus of strangeness from the perspective Barth came to know, love, and develop theologically to Blackness in America as the locus theologicus? How does this shift relate to our efforts to understand Barth and politics, despite the dastardly and that Barth often criticizes? Long, of course, answers this question by relocating the site of strangeness. He writes, quote, in putting this question to Barth, I was at the same time echoing for myself the constant enigma of my native land. The fact that my native land has always been for me a strange place, close quote. And according to Long, Barth put his finger on the locus for the strangeness when he described Long as a dusky theological colleague, a literally black colleague, close quote. By the way, I think Barth adds to this problem when he fails to name Long in the book, Evangelical Theology, for this decision contributes unwittingly to the problem of invisibility. But what might we find if we shift from what Barth identifies as God's first order witness to God's self in Revelation to the creatorial sphere as a first order witness within the sphere of Revelation? Please note the subtlety of my distinction. I am raising a question about a point of dogmatic emphasis within Revelation, not questioning the priority of Revelation. Said differently, in identifying Blackness as the locus of strangeness, I'm not attempting to make Black experience into an ultimate referent. Rather, I'm accentuating Blackness within the framework of Revelation, a point of emphasis which represents an extension of Barth's thinking, a counterpoint, locus or place, and given the dangers within Barth context, it is a place he hardly wanted to address. What happens, or what might we find when the world of God, which includes this world, is reimagined and analogized in such a way that our modes of power within this world, within this land, are called into question, not simply by God, but by the creation itself, by a more animated visual and oral participation within creation that sees and hears the voice of creation over against the powers and principalities in the world, or what Barth might identify as the chthonic powers. Allow me to say more. Part of my interest, as I noted in the chapter in this book called Karl Barth and Liberation Theology, I have it here in case you want to purchase it. That's from the 2018 Barth conference. So it's not just a book about my paper. Anyway, part of this issue, my issue, lies in transposing Barth and Cohn into a new key. This shift includes how we understand the relationship between the discipline of theology and the discipline of Black religion, and religion writ large. Of course, there are many ways to tease out this relationship, but I've chosen to revisit this enigmatic meeting in 1962 between Long and Barth, which was an occasion that occurred during Barth's only visit to America, where we stand and witness to a brief conversation between Barth, the grand theologian of the time, and Long, the consummate historian of religions, our hermeneutic. Now, for those of you who do not know Charles Long, he was a student of Joachim Bach and collaborated academically with Mircea Eliade, Joseph Kitagawa, and Jonathan Z. Smith in establishing the history of religions as a discipline, arguably into a school at Chicago. And I'm going to read a brief section from my book, and if I have to cut things later, I will. It says, Long's work problematizes the tendency to oppose dogmatic categories and human experiences, a tendency that serves often to hold the experience of Black life at a distance from theological inquiry. A primary concern is the interpretation of Black cultural symbols and religious ways of being are often rendered invisible or subservient to systematic conventions. Indeed, if Barth's emphasis on revelation functions primarily as a way to distinguish God's word from worldviews, Weltanschauung, religions, politics, and signs, including any natural phenomena interpreted as a sign of faith, a lack of attention to the context in which theological inquiry is undertaken, as well as an overemphasis on established conventions, can actually serve to narrow the theological imagination. Dogmatic categories and human experiences began to function as polar opposites, with the result being that the new political and religious possibilities, particularly the polyphony of meanings in signs, symbols, secular parables, or other secular spirituals, will remain unconsidered. Now, back to this paper. So, to accomplish this, I want to note up front Charles Long's redefinition of religion. Religion for Long is not a belief system. It is something more than what one believes. It is not an attempt at a mastery of revelation. It is not a metaphysical claim about revelation. There is, and this is Barth's language, there is no attempt at bridging a gap between Christ and God and Long. It is rather a mode of, quote, orientation in the ultimate sense, that is, how one comes to terms with the ultimate significance of one's place in the world. It addresses culture and history, close quote. This is a fundamentally different definition of religion than Karl Barth's definition. As an aside, I often note that Long expands Barth's view of religion and deepens Cohn's view of revelation. Barth, on the other hand, as many of you know, often framed religion in contrast to revelation. Notwithstanding his nuanced use of Auf Hebung in the Church Dogmatics, Volume 1-2, Section 17, but still, in a short speech to foreign students from developing countries in 1963, Barth takes pains to distinguish between Christianity and religion. The title of the speech is called Christianity or Religion? Question mark. He argues that, quote, Christianity is essentially a pointer, pointing backwards and forwards, and in either case, upwards towards the movement of this different being, a movement that differs from all religions, all human leaps and superstructures, and is indeed opposed to all religion, close quote. Here we witness Barth framing the discussion in a way that accents the distinction between Christianity and religion, rather than attempting to acknowledge an affinity between revelation and religion. Another way to think of this is that Barth is emphasizing an eschatological proviso between Christianity falsely understood and the religion he perceived as taking place within various sectors of the world. Barth made a similar hermeneutical turn in his discussion of revelation in the Church Dogmatics, Volume 1, Section 10. However, when commenting on this section in introductory remarks to his students, Barth probed students, asking if they liked the paragraph on, quote, God the Father. He then proceeds to argue that he would not write it the same way if he was writing it today. That was around 1953. He thinks that by describing God as the Lord of our existence, that he betrayed a remnant of existentialism in his thought. God, in Barth's estimation, is Lord not only of our existence, but of all that is not God. Barth then thus critiques his own anthropocentrism. He states the following. 4 minutes already. Whew. Our existence is only a part of what God has created. The powerful love of God is the meaning of creation. God going out from himself and allowing creation to exist in order to describe this lordship of our existence. And he says quite a bit more here, but I'm going to go to the very end of it. Here, the notion of fatherhood, according to Barth, this is still a quote, is cold. It does not give the impression of the warm love of the Father. And I should not have spoken of Golgotha. There is too much, he says. This reminds me too much of my Roma brief, Barth writes. Barth closes with these poignant words. At the time I wrote this, I did not know that God was creator of heaven and earth. Humanity is too important here. Volume 3 is a much better presentation of the doctrine of creation. I've learned much, Barth says. Then in an appeal to Calvin, Barth writes the following: nature is a theater of God's work with humanity. In this caveat about his own theologizing, Barth exposes the way he reified the distinction between revelation or the creator and creation, or Christianity and religion. And if we follow Barth uncritically, we will fall back into the more polemical position that he himself criticizes. Thus, the signal turn from Barth's insight into his early theology leads me to turn to the dogma of creation in this paper. For I want to identify with Barth's movement of openness in contrast to the way that he reified the distinction between revelation and religion, and turn to a more holistic view of creation, an affirmative turn to a type of affinity with Long's reading of Barth. It may come as a surprise that Charles Long read Barth's Roma brief in a way that takes seriously God's openness to the creation. And I want you to hear this quote, even though I'm going to have to skip some things right afterward. How we're looking in terms of time. One more minute. Oh. All right. So another point of musing here, this is Charles Long, another point of musing here on the theological ethics issue. I've always felt that had James Cone remained within his early Barthian theological position, a much more distinctive and powerful Black theology might have emerged. The way I see it is that Barth was pushing a very radical form of Calvinism, a Calvinism that probably out-secularized the most secular, maybe best approximated by Hauerwas at this time. In other words, the intersection of the God/human connection is muted, few mutualities and less continuity. And Long says this: but one must have faith, and not faith that one's program will succeed or one's rights vindicated, etc., but faith in the ultimate fact that God created the world and in so doing defined a purpose and meaning for all of its creatures. Beyond that, a few guarantees. Now I'm going to skip some material here, and I just want to turn to close with a word or two about this idea of strayed fruit, and then I'll close. Long often talked about the Mediterranean world and the Atlantic world. And in contrast to the Mediterranean world, Long argues that the Atlantic world is the revealer of a negative revelation, a revelation that has insinuated itself within the meanings of all other relationships of the world of modernity. The Africans, he says, secreted within the bowels of slave ships of commerce that bore names like Brotherhood, John the Baptist, Justice, Integrity, Gift of God, Liberty, and Jesus. They were equally harbingers of modernity, structurers of a primordium of the modern order of the world. The problem of a negative revelation in the modern world and the grotesque and bizarre way we identify Christianity with oddly named ships of commerce brings me to the poem about strange fruit that informs this strange place called the United States. When one shifts the locus of strangeness to illuminate various points within this second creation, and Long changes it, second creation created by ships and things like that, he contrasts that with the first creation, okay? He said, when one turns in this way, we experience a type of inversion. So when you think of a psalm, like Psalm 19, heavens declare the glory of God, and the skies proclaim the work of his hand. Day after day they pour forth speech. Night after night they reveal knowledge. They have no speech, there are no words, no sound is heard from them. Yet their voice goes out into all the world, all the earth. Their words to the ends of the world. In the heavens, God has pitched a tent for the sun. It's like a bridegroom coming out of his chamber, like a champion, rejoicing to run his course, rises at one end of the heavens, makes its circuit to the other, and nothing is deprived of its warmth. But when we turn to the poem Strange Fruit, and I'm closing, the strangeness shifts from the way Barth conceives it in the Bible to blackness as the locus of this strangeness. It corresponds to the negative revelation, or what Edward Schillebeck may call the negative contrast experience. A Black life in America is bound up with creation. The creation itself becomes a first-order witness, revealing human injustice, or what Barth might call a godless existence. The terms of creation, of course, have now changed. We must come to terms with a sun that rots, a wind that sucks, birds that pluck, and leaves that drop, which is probably a reference to the body of the lynched victim. rain that gathers. The seeds of the poplar tree are watered in this way, and its limbs supporting the hanging black body stands out. This second creation is a macabre microcosm of a cosmos, with all these images that adorn this pastoral scene of the gallant South, all participate and first order witness to human degradation. Thank you.
And then as our third speaker, I welcome Emily Woolton, alumna of our program, and currently serving United Methodists in Greater New Jersey.
Thanks, Hannah, and everyone. Great to be here. My paper is entitled A Wholesomely Disturbing Presence, bringing Stout to bear on Barth's vision for Christian political engagement. The U.S. Capitol insurrection on January 6, 2021 was, according to sociologists Philip Gorski and Samuel Perry, the eruption of a growing yet often invisible force, the ideology of white Christian nationalism. They argue that this ideology functions by virtue of a deep story about America's past and a vision for its future. Its story includes the belief that America was founded by Christian men on Christian principles, that it is a country blessed by God and destined for a special role in God's plan for humanity, but that it is, quote, threatened by cultural degradation from un-American influences, both inside and outside its borders. I feel as though I should pause to say that I am not American. The story also includes a vision for America's future as a Christian nation ruled by Christians. The whiteness of this Christian America and its rulers is rarely stated, but is rather often, or I would say always, assumed. This deep story gives rise to strong views on a number of issues, everything from racial discrimination to human sexuality and 1,000 others, all held together by a particular understanding of freedom, order, and violence. The political vision of white Christian nationalism is one construed in us versus them terms, and it calls its adherents to fight, violently if necessary, for white Christian America. For Christians who assess white Christian nationalism as dangerous and sinful, which I won't unpack here, but I will say that I am one of them, the question about whether and how to engage one's Christian faith in political discourse becomes crucial. How do we respond to white Christian nationalism? This paper proceeds from the contention that Karl Barth's approach to Christian political engagement, as described in the Christian community and the civil community, can provide us with a faithful and responsible line and direction for our time. This paper will briefly describe why before turning to a critical examination of Barth's claim in that essay that, quote, in the political sphere, Christians can bring in their Christianity only anonymously, end quote. Drawing on the work of Jeff Stout, I will argue that to faithfully engage in the political landscape in the United States, this claim must at the very least be nuanced, if not abandoned altogether. I will conclude by indicating a direction for future constructive work that could build on this critique. Our time together today does not allow me to fully describe the nature of Barth's approach to Christian political engagement as outlined in the essay, but I will just highlight a couple of its features. In his essay, The Christian Civil Community and the Christian Community, Barth describes these two communities as both standing under the lordship of Jesus Christ in the as yet unredeemed world. As such, both communities stand in positive relationship to one another. The role of the civil community being to establish and maintain external, relative, and provisional peace and justice for those within it, including the Christian community. And the role of the Christian community being first and foremost to remain the church that, quote, proclaims the rule of Jesus Christ and the hope of the kingdom of God, end quote. For Barth, while this proclamation includes prayer for the civil community, if it is taken seriously, it will go beyond prayer to work actively on behalf of that community by, quote, choosing the political possibilities which most suggest a correspondence to the content of its own faith and gospel. This gospel is a gospel for all humanity, and so the decisions that reflect it will inevitably be decisions that are for and not against humanity. Decisions that will always prioritize human beings over abstract causes or principles. Barth is careful to make clear that these choices are to be made on the basis of the criterion of the knowledge of Jesus Christ as Lord of all. Christian political choices ought not be defined by adherence to a particular Christian doctrine of the state, nor by principled allegiance to a political program, idea, or system. And they certainly must not proceed as a defense of a, quote, class conditioned outlook and morality. Herein, we can see the departure of Barth's approach from that of white Christian nationalist ideology. Practically speaking, Barth suggests that these choices will be put into action first through preaching, whether in direct or indirect illumination of the political problems of the day, but also through public proclamations about political issues by ecclesial bodies, through responsible Christian writing and journalism, by the life of the church modeling a gospel driven existence in its own affairs, and by the faithfulness of individual Christians in the political sphere. Taken as a whole, Barth's approach to Christian political engagement is focused on Jesus Christ, serious about its responsibilities, and careful not only to avoid the pitfalls of Christian nationalism, but also gives the space and tools to boldly stand against it. However, despite its virtues, Barth also makes what to me was the surprising claim at 3 different points in the essay that Christians should be anonymous and indirect about their Christian faith when it comes to political discourse. He says, for instance, quote, in the political sphere, the Christian community can draw attention to its gospel only indirectly, as reflected in its political decisions, and these decisions can be made intelligible and brought to victory not because they are based on Christian premises, but only because they are politically better and more calculated to preserve and develop the common life, end quote. Additionally, Barth argues that, as I said, in the political sphere, Christians can bring in their Christianity only anonymously. And he says that breaking through this anonymity can only be done by waging a political battle for the church and thereby bringing discredit and disgrace on the Christian name. What does the Red Pastor, the author of the Barmen Declaration, mean by all this? Surely he cannot mean that Christians should never make public statements about their faith-based reasons for political positions. We've already seen he advocates doing just that through preaching, ecclesial proclamations, Christian publications, and so on. In what context, then, does he envision Christian anonymity as necessary when it comes to politics? A clue might be found in that Barth makes his statements about this in the context of arguments against forming a special Christian political party. For Barth to form a Christian political party against other non-Christian parties would betray the Christian community's responsibility to be for the entire civil community and not against any of its members. It is important for Barth that decisions based on Christian premises are not only decisions for Christians and their perhaps special interests, but that they are the best decisions for all people in the civil community. Further, Barth argues that for such a party to operate with Christian qualities, it would not be a very effective political party. Likewise, to fully operate as a political party would most certainly compromise its Christian message and content. Perhaps then, when Barth insists on Christian anonymity and refraining from bringing Christian premises into political discourse, his primary concern is that Christians do not enter the political sphere under the banner of an explicitly Christian political party. In my view, we would do well to follow Barth's advice on the matter of Christian political parties, whether the label appears in the party name or the party's members simply claim the term for themselves. His concerns with such parties, I believe, are being borne out in the shape that white Christian nationalism is taking in the United States today. However, Barth could well have made the point about the ineffectiveness and dangers of Christian political parties without including his statements about Christian anonymity and indirectness in the political sphere. I see no reason why faithful Christians could not be explicit about the Christian premises for their decisions without claiming Christianity for a particular political party. Yet Barth seems either not to see this as a possibility or to see it as one that should be avoided, There are some other options of maybe what Barth meant there, but I won't delve into all that at this time. This is where I think we must press beyond Barth, not to disagree with him, then to at least look for some clarity, provide some clarity about what is meant here or what we should do now. And for that, I am going to turn to Jeff Stout. Barth's claim that in the political sphere, Christians ought not make their decisions intelligible, basis of explicitly Christian premises, bears some resemblance to the position of certain philosophers who seek to limit, if not ban, the use of religious reasoning in public political discourse. In his 2004 work, Democracy and Tradition, Jeff Stout subjects this position to scrutiny. Stout lifts up the concerns of thinkers like John Rawls and Richard Rorty about the place of religion in political discourse, which include both pragmatic and moral concerns. Pragmatically, Stout admits relying on religious reasoning can be effective in political discourse, can be ineffective in political discourse when those engaged in it do not share the same religious beliefs. Religious reasons are unlikely to be compelling to those who do not share them. Morally, as according to John Rawls, introducing religious reasons into the public forum can also be perceived as undemocratic, implying a disrespect for those who do not share one's religious beliefs. For Rawls and Rorty, it is important that political discourse proceed on the basis of premises upon which all its participants can either agree or at least which they cannot reasonably reject. Although Barth is coming at the question from a different angle, we can see here a resemblance to Barth's claim that in the political sphere, Christians can only reply in the form of decisions which could be the decisions of any other citizens, regardless of their religious profession. And that was a quote, which ends now. However, Stout is critical of both the pragmatic and moral arguments for restricting religious reasoning in political discourse. He argues that religious convictions, by their very nature, deeply impact people's views on basic and essential matters of justice. And given that so many citizens hold these convictions, little of import could actually be accomplished if religious reasoning were to be restricted in political discourse. When it comes to the matter of showing respect for one's political interlocutors, Stout argues that the quote, conception of respect assumed in the objection to arguing from religious premises seems flawed. It neglects the ways in which one can show respect for another person in his or her particularity. End quote. Respect does not require arguing from commonly held premises, but can be shown by, quote, offering different reasons to each of our interlocutors, reasons relevant from their point of view, end quote. Stout holds that there can be a difference between our reasons for arriving at a political conclusion and then the reasons that we might offer to others that they should adopt that same conclusion. To be authentic in political conversation, religious persons should not be barred from sharing their real reasons for their conclusions. And to show respect in political conversation, they can offer different reasons for why their particular interlocutors ought to arrive at the same ones. In my view, Stout's approach offers a more nuanced understanding of the place of Christian premises in the political sphere than what Barth offers us. How are we doing for time? All right. More important, though, than establishing that Christian premises can feature in political discourse without bringing that discourse to a halt or disrespecting those who do not share them, is to consider why it is important for Christians who do not subscribe to the white Christian nationalist ideology, why it is important for them to be explicit about their Christianity as they reason and act politically. Stout argues that restricting citizens from giving religious reasons in political discourse is damaging to democracy and exacerbates the narrative that the United States is locked in an intractable culture war between, quote, an authoritarian form of traditionalism and an anti-religious form of liberalism, end quote, each of which thrive by inflating the other's importance. As citizens try to appeal to one another on the basis of premises that are acceptable to everyone, as Barth alongside Rawls and Rorty seem to suggest, Their vocabulary becomes thinned out. And the more that happens, the less citizens understand each other's personal languages of deliberation, what's going on inside each of us to arrive at the conclusions that we've come to. According to Stout, public discussions can then easily degenerate into a series of attempts to manipulate the populace for unstated reasons. And when this happens, cynicism about political speech can spread rapidly, and individuals prefer to withdraw into smaller, more uniform communities. And I would add where mono narratives that vilify the opponents can thrive in these smaller, more uniform communities. This is precisely what we can see happening now. The antidote is not to restrict religious voices in political discourse, but to attempt a converse thickening of the vocabulary we use within it. As Stout puts it, democracy would profit if more citizens engaged in lengthy, even leisurely unfolding of their commitments. For Christians who are concerned about how white Christian nationalism is impacting their nation and about how it is representing Christianity, I would suggest that such lengthy and leisurely conversations in which their theological commitments and the bearing of those commitments on political decisions are made explicit could play an important role in shaping a healthier political landscape. Remaining indirect and anonymous about our Christianity in the political sphere, as Barth suggests, but as his life's example seems to contradict, is rather likely to contribute to the impression that white Christian nationalism and anti-religious liberalism are the only two options before us, a sort of hollowing out of the theological middle. If, as Barth says, the Christian community is to be a wholesomely disturbing presence, that comes from Barth, in the civil community, revolving around the center who is Jesus Christ, it cannot leave this impression of only two options undisturbed. In this paper, I've tried to show that Barth offers a promising direction for Christians who seek to take the political implications of their faith seriously in a context where white Christian nationalism features dominantly. However, I've also argued that Barth's claim that Christians should remain anonymous and indirect in the political sphere, in terms of communicating the premises upon which they make their political decisions, is at best misguided and insufficiently nuanced. Rather, by respectfully sharing our own reasons for reaching political decisions and engaging the points of view of our particular interlocutors, Christians can disrupt the narrative of the culture wars in which we currently find ourselves in the United States today. While I do not have time to develop a constructive proposal for incorporating Stout's insights into a Barthian theological framework, I would suggest that such a proposal could fruitfully be pursued by drawing together Stout's analysis of the role that expressive freedom plays in the development of social norms, and Barth's account of Christian freedom. Until then, I will leave you with Stout's advice offered with a Barthian twist, and that is to cultivate the virtues of democratic speech, love Jesus, and say what you please.